We're going to continue extending our ideas of linear models by looking at two-way analysis of variance. So the question is, two terms interact, and then what is the main effect? So what we're going to look at today is a graphical approach to this, and we're going to try to motivate what we mean by this. So really there are two types of interaction terms. There are more, but we're going to just kind of focus on a categorical variable with another categorical variable, or a categorical variable with a quantitative variable. And we'll look at that a little bit later. So the question is, does the effect of one factor depend on the level of another factor? And that's the question, is whether there's an interaction between factors. And we'll try to motivate this with food. So which is better, ice cream or hamburgers? And then which is better, ketchup or chocolate sauce? Well, you might say it depends. If we took a survey, and I made up this data, people like hamburgers over ice cream. So if you have the line plot, looks at hamburgers over ice cream. And then we might say, okay, people like chocolate over ketchup. But what if we put them together? Well, it's a disaster. If we put ketchup on our ice cream, very, very few people like that, although I guess there are some people do. And if we put chocolate sauce on our hamburgers, we may get onto that food dives and dive, whatever that food is, may get on that, but very few people are going to like that. So if we only examine the main effect and then look at some of the factors that affect that, we could be in trouble. So if we just took the top ones, hey, hamburgers look good. Most people like hamburgers. Most people like chocolate. So let's put them together. Instead, what we should look at are some of the interactions, and serve ice cream with chocolate sauce would be our best choice here, if we wanted to please our friends, whoever we had over for dinner. The worst thing to do would be to serve the two items from the top two categories. So we have to kind of see what kind of factors won. It may be that someone is the best because of some other factor upon it. For example, is Tom Brady the greatest quarterback, or is it just because he had the factor of Bill Belichick? Maybe Sonny Jurgensen would have been the greatest quarterback if he had a good coach. So let's take another example. Do steroids have a different effect on men than on women? I'm not claiming these individuals use steroids, by the way. It's a kind of a broader question, and there's an ethical question that corresponds to that. Did the medical community shortchange women? Sort of like the idea that all the studies, that's an exaggeration, but most of the studies just looked at men and then said, well, women are the same. So there are some couple of links you could look at why medical research often ignores women, why that is. And then a counterpoint is that the gender gap in health, women outlive men, and men cost more in the gender part, and so that's part of it. But if we do a study, it might be that in this kind of situation, what's called the disordinal effect. You don't have to know the term disordinal effect for this course, but it might be beneficial for you later. If you take a look at this, the females are in red and the males are in green. And so if you give a treatment to males, it has no effect on them. They're the green line. They go from one side to the other. But if you take a look at the females, the treatment, I don't know if it's positive, it raises or lowers it, but it starts off at a control of about 1.5. If you give them the treatment, then it goes up to 4.5. So in some sense, we have to control for various parts. So there may be some interaction here that's going on. And in this case, if the lines cross, then that's called a disordinal effect. And the key takeaway here is, do not interpret main effects for a significant disordinal interaction, or basically for a significant interaction. So let's kind of say when we can tell when there's interaction between factors. Well, if they cross, then we could say, yes, there is interaction, they're not parallel. And if they don't cross and they kind of look parallel, then we could say there's no interaction, at least graphically taking a look at it. Here, the difference in likes between The Office and Riverdale do not appear to depend on gender. What about those who like the Bird Box and To All the Boys I Loved Before? Well, in this data that I made up, it does appear that women who may like Netflix movies slightly more than men liked To All the Boys I Loved Before much more than boys did. So graphically, there are three variables here. There's the mean score, that's on the y-axis. There's the movies, and that's on the x-axis. And then there's gender, and that's in some sense you either have the color or the dotted line or the red line. So a researcher may know, yeah, there is an average difference in how the genders like a particular genre, but does it depend on the movie? So does the average difference in the male and female score depend on the movies? For this particular case, for these particular two movies, yes, it graphically does. It's not parallel. So again, the researcher has concluded a difference, but if the difference between genders were the same regardless of the movie, then the lines would be parallel. So here we have three variables. We have the mean score, we have the condiment on the x-axis, and then the hamburger and ice cream. And so what we're asking here is, does the average difference in hamburger and ice cream depend upon the condiment down here? And so yes, graphically they're not parallel. So that's kind of the idea. Is the difference between these two factors, or these two levels, depend on the factors down here? Does it depend on the condiment used? In this case, yes. So we know there's a difference between the muscle mass on average than non-athletes. Sorry, for athletes than non-athletes. But does it depend on whether they're using steroids, growth hormones, performance-enhancing drugs? Well, that was one of my examples, and I decided against it. So I tried this example instead. Let's try muscle mass for non-athletes and top athletes. So I changed the example. I still made up the data. So which graph do we want? We know there's a difference between the muscle mass for top athletes and non-athletes, but it does depend on whether the person is male or female. You should stop your video and kind of determine whether it's A or B. And so if you do that, then graph B would help us answer, does the average difference between non-athlete and athlete depend on gender? Graph A would ask, does the average difference in muscle mass between males and females depend on whether they're a top athlete or not? So that's one thing that you can try to do to understand the interaction plots. Now, you don't just have to restrict yourself to two factors. You could have multiple factors. So does the average difference in muscle mass between sport depend on gender? Or does the average difference in muscle mass between males and females depend on the sport they play? So match the red to the one on the left or the right, and the green to the one on the left or the right. Again, pause and try to make that note. And the answer is, again, the average difference in muscle mass between sports depends on gender. And the other one is, does the average difference in muscle mass between sexes, or males and females, depend on the sport they play? Now the question is, how do we determine whether these are parallel or not? And that's kind of what we'll talk about that in a future video. Are they parallel? Well, remember, there's going to be variation. We just took a sample. Your data could have been different. And so we'll need a numerical test result to help us. And that's where next time we're going to know what we know about linear models and interaction terms to determine whether there's an interaction between factors. Okay, trying to get back to you to stop this video. Sorry for the extra 15 seconds, but this is kind of an important thing when we talk about controlling and determining whether an interaction is variable. So this is kind of an important section.